One of the things that superheroes are known for are their dual identities. There's the person they are at home and the identity they adopt when they go out to fight crime. Or sometimes their mundane persona is the mask and their chosen identity more accurately reflects who they are at their core. Even in the Marvel movies, where their dual identities aren't secret identities, there's still a relationship between who someone is in the costume and who they are outside of it. And the character who started the whole trend of discarding secret identities has an entire movie dedicated to exploring the friction between Iron Man and Tony Stark. For DC characters, Superman takes things a step further. Rather than just having two identities to juggle, he has three. The first is Clark Kent, the kid from Smallville who grew up on a farm and worked as a mild-mannered reporter for the Daily Planet newspaper. The second is Kal-El, the last son of Krypton and an alien outsider to Earth. The third is Superman, the world's greatest superhero. And something I noticed when making my last video about Superman movies is that the cinematic versions of the character don't treat each of these identities equally. And especially in the 21st century, they pick one of those identities to represent who Superman is, with the others almost being roles that he plays. The 1978 movie is primarily interested in the interplay between Clark Kent and Superman, with Christopher Reeve's performance being celebrated largely because of how he manages to distinguish the two characters. But he's not the only actor to play the role. In the first act of the movie, Clark Kent is played as a teenager by Jeff East, with Reeve dubbing his voice. This is a Clark Kent who's frustrated by having to hide his true strength. This is a Clark Kent who likes to show off when he thinks nobody's looking or when the people looking will never see him again. This is a Clark Kent who, after losing a father, gains a new one and spends several off-screen years living as Kal-El before re-emerging as Christopher Reeve in the flesh, though he goes nameless until being christened Superman by Lois Lane. Their pre-flight interview even avoids directly answering the question of what he calls himself at this stage in his life, unless he calls himself Pink.
Do you have a first name?
What do you mean, like Ralph or something?
No, I mean like,
Pink.
Huh?
But Pink can't be Superman all the time, so sometimes he pretends to be Clark Kent. Not the frustrated teenager from the first act of the movie, but a cartoonish caricature that's at least as out of place in 1970s urban America as a flying man in blue tights is. The Clark Kent from the first act of the movie is gone, and in his place is Pink's shitposting account. Pink doesn't exist in 2006's Superman Returns, though. Instead of a synthesis of Clark and an unseen Kal-El, Brandon Routh's version of the character is almost entirely Kal-El. The beginning of the film finds him returning home from a journey to Krypton, where he'd hoped to find some evidence of the planet's survival. He doesn't, and when he comes back to Earth, he finds the world has moved on without both Superman and Clark, which increases his feelings of alienation and isolation. Marlon Brando's Jor-El is featured prominently in the movie, despite the actor being dead at the time of production, and it's his words, not those of Jonathan Kent, that Kal-El repeats to his own son at the end of the film. 2013's Man of Steel pivoted in the other direction and showed us someone who identified exclusively as Clark Kent. He grew up as Clark Kent, he traveled the world as Clark Kent, he saved people's lives as Clark Kent. He didn't come face to face with his Kryptonian heritage until he was well into adulthood, and when he did, he rejected it, choosing to save Earth instead of giving Krypton a second chance. Kal-El was a name given to him by a father he never knew, and Superman was a title he didn't feel he was worthy of. But that's not the case anymore, because in 2025, we have a Superman movie that's finally putting the focus on that other element of the character. Not Clark Kent, not Kal-El, not even Pink. Superman is a movie about Superman. Because of the mythic significance of the Superman character, the massive budgets of these kinds of movies, and the amount of attention they bring, each new Superman movie can't just be the live-action equivalent of a random comic book issue or episode of a cartoon. It's not enough to just be a Superman movie. Each new take has to be the new Superman movie that defines who the character is for modern audiences. And James Gunn's Superman movie is really effective at defining him very quickly for 2025. Just from the text that opens the film, we know that metahumans like Superman have been around for centuries, so this version of Superman doesn't represent an existential crisis for the world the way Henry Cavill's did. We know that Superman has been operating publicly for 3 years. That's long enough for him to have found his footing and for the world to have gotten used to his existence, but not so long that he's become commonplace. This isn't Man of Steel's first day on the job, and it's not the absentee dad from Superman Returns. And we know that this Superman has never lost a battle. Until now. The movie absorbs decades of pop culture, credit card commercials, SNL skits, Canadian Heritage Minutes, and it says, yep, that's Superman. By not making him existentially terrifying, by making him seasoned, by making him seemingly invulnerable, even by retaining the John Williams music that has come to represent the character outside of that original movie, this film doesn't tell us to leave our preconceptions about the character at the door. It actually welcomes them, and it makes him the version of the character that you might expect to see if you did just happen to open a random comic book one day or tune into a random Superman cartoon. And after these opening moments, the movie tells us more about who this version of Superman is. In the Fortress of Solitude, his Superman robots refer to him as Superman. Not Clark, not Kal-El, but Superman. In his private residence, that's who he identifies as. Kal-El and Clark are still important parts of him, but the synthesis of those two beings, the complete version of himself, is Superman, the superhero character. And once he's healed, he says things like golly and what the hey. This version of Superman is an unapologetic cornball. That corniness of the Superman character has always been something that the live-action Superman movies have tried to deal with. The Christopher Nolan-produced Man of Steel approached the character in the same way as Batman Begins, by trying to find practical and realistic explanations for things. His suit is Kryptonian underwear. The Fortress of Solitude is a crashed spaceship. Clark Kent has spent most of his adult life as a lone wanderer, so he has a quieter, more introspective personality. The 1978 movie embraced Superman's corniness and intentionally contrasted the simplistic comic book character against gritty late 70s America. He was an uncomplicated good guy at a time where that was needed. Superman Returns, which was designed as a pseudo-sequel to 1980's Superman 2, maintains some of Superman's out-of-place corniness. After all, the movie is largely about how he doesn't belong. But the emotional core of the movie is about his relationship with Lois Lane, and the world moving on from Superman is an extension of her moving on from him. So the movie still tries to make things feel cohesive. Superman's bright red cape and boots are toned down, the S on his chest is smaller and sharper, and the movie's airplane rescue makes an attempt at challenging him with realistic physics. The movie is also willing to meet Superman halfway. The Daily Planet has traded low ceilings and fluorescent lights for an Art Deco cavern with soft, warm lighting. Characters dress anachronistically, they drive decades-old vehicles, and the movie's warm color grading gives it an almost sepia-toned look sometimes. The new movie doesn't feel the need to justify Superman's existence in reality, contrast him against reality, or even meet him halfway. In the new Superman movie, he just is. He has a Fortress of Solitude, he has Superman robots, he wears his underwear on the outside, and that's just the way things are. The movie accepts that Superman is, and it decides that that's a good thing, silliness included. So instead of putting him in the real world or having him meet his world in the middle, Superman is the axis of this world's rotation. He remains stationary while everyone else reacts to him. Superman's intervention in an international conflict between the fictitious countries of Baravia and Jarhanpur and the fallout from those events is a big part of the film's story, and something like that was also a big part of 2016's Batman v Superman. But although the Wikipedia plot summary events of the movies are similar, they serve different purposes in each film. In Beavis, the focus is on how Clark himself reacts to the backlash against his actions. He questions whether he's doing the right thing, if he can be the Superman the world wants him to be, and if he might eventually become the dangerous being that some people already think he is. In the new movie, the purpose is not to make us question Superman, but to reassure us about him. This Superman is much more confident about what he's doing, and the backlash against him doesn't make him introspect at all. When he grants Lois Lane an interview, he expects the same kind of softball questions that he gives himself as Clark Kent, and he gets upset when she presses him on whether or not he should be intervening in international politics without consulting anyone. He doesn't care about flags or borders, he cares about saving lives and helping people. In the interview, Lois lays out several reasons why his actions could have been wrong. He illegally entered Baravia without permission, he got involved in a very tense geopolitical situation, he sided against a country that was historically an ally of the United States, and he tortured and threatened that country's leader. As a retaliation against all this, Baravia even sends their own superhero to Metropolis to cause a ruckus, but the character is immediately revealed to be under the control of Lex Luthor. Then we find out that the president of Baravia is also working with Luthor, and eventually we learn that the entire situation between Baravia and Jarhanpur was manufactured by Luthor specifically because he knew Superman would get involved and wanted an excuse to kill him. Even the social media backlash against Superman turns out to have been completely manufactured, with Luthor using an army of monkeys to post mean things about him online. So the messy political situation Lois was grilling him about turns out to not even exist. Superman's ethos of putting one foot in front of the other and trying to make the best choices he can is justified. Now, this Superman does admit to screwing up sometimes, but does he actually? This is a movie, so obviously he wins in the end, but throughout the film there are moments where Superman is able to save every individual person or animal that needs him, or inspire others to do so in his absence. None of the enemies he fights end up dying. His battle with Ultraman lets him keep his hands clean by literally putting him on the bus and sending him out of the movie. And while we know that Superman could beat Lex Luthor to a bloody pulp, we know that he wouldn't and shouldn't, so Krypto gets to do it instead. The only real blemish on his record is the death of Malik Ali, who's killed by Lex Luthor in a truncated game of Russian roulette. But Malik is entirely willing to die for Superman, even reassuring him that he doesn't have a family and saying it was an honor just to serve him food one time. And that major twist that kicks off the second act of the movie, that Superman's Kryptonian parents sent him to conquer Earth rather than help it, raises doubt specifically so that doubt can be erased. Superman didn't know about this before it was revealed to the world, so he wasn't hiding anything from anyone, and there's no suggestion that he was ever even subconsciously driven to achieve their goal, so it doesn't really reflect badly on Superman at all. But like in Batman v Superman, this does make him doubt himself. And rather than the idea of a Superman gone bad hanging over the rest of the film and potentially even the sequel, the message here ultimately just reinforces how good and pure Superman is. Up until this point, his assumption that his parents wanted him to help humanity was what drove him to be a superhero. But with the truth exposed, his goodness is no longer something passed down to him or a task assigned by someone else. It's something innate, something that he chose for himself. Superman isn't good because he was told to be or raised to be. Superman is good because Superman is good. And after Superman's innate goodness is established, the social consequences of the Kryptonian message just kind of disappear as well. While people do turn on Superman initially, Lex Luthor's collaboration with Baravia takes over public discussion by the end of the movie, and the news outlets that criticized him then apologize to Superman for doubting him. This movie is a celebration of the mythological Superman. The challenges and questions the story raises are answered by affirming that yes, he is good, and his kindness, his openness, and his instinctive choices to do what's right are correct. Some Superman movies depict the struggle to do good. They create dramatic consequences for having to choose which lives to save. They show the loneliness that comes with the burden of being the only person who can help. And they suggest that there's not always a clean solution to every problem. This Superman doesn't do that. Instead, it says that maybe good is easy. Superman's lack of introspection isn't a flaw, it's a virtue, because being altruistic and kind and just helping people should come naturally to us. In stories, the actions of children are often designed to represent a kind of unfiltered view of the world, and the kids in this movie instinctively know and trust that Superman is good and he'll always be there for them in their time of need. And that's fine for Superman, a fictional character who the movie goes out of its way to make sure can save every dog and squirrel that's in trouble, but what about everyone else? If the movie wants to suggest that Superman's kindness and openness is something like a countercultural movement, shouldn't we also be able to participate? Shouldn't the world be full of Supermen? Well, in this movie, it is. One of the ways the movie demonstrates what makes Superman Superman is by contrasting him against other characters. There are several characters in the movie who are similar, but they all fall short in certain ways. The first is Krypto. As a Kryptonian dog, he has all of Superman's strength, but he's just an undisciplined animal, and he needs to be guided in order to actually be helpful. Power by itself is meaningless, and Superman's strength alone isn't what enables him to be a good person. Next, the movie shows us Superman's Superman robots. They resemble him superficially and have more ability to think than Krypto, but they lack Superman's human sense of morality. They look after Krypto while he's away, but by their own admission, they're unable to care whether he lives or dies. The movie also introduces the Hammer of Baravia. This is a literal Man of Steel who's secretly the Lex Luthor-controlled Ultraman, who is secretly a clone of Superman. Ultraman has enough of a mind to pretend to be the Hammer, and he can take tactical orders from Lex Luthor, but he's otherwise basically Luthor's own Superman robot. As the Hammer, he's a stooge for a government that just wants to hurt people, and as Ultraman, he mindlessly follows the orders of a petty, spiteful tech bro. A real Superman can think for himself and doesn't just do what he's told. Supergirl, who shows up briefly towards the end of the movie, also has all of Superman's powers, and she has all of his human emotions, but rather than choosing to help people, she prefers to hit up intergalactic dive bars and leave her cousin to look after her dog. And there's also a lot of non-Kryptonian metahumans in the movie. The Engineer has a lot of fantastic powers, but she gave up her humanity in order to fight against Superman and became just another of Lex Luthor's pawns. And unlike Ultraman, who doesn't seem to have much choice in the matter, or Supergirl, who is just irresponsible, the Engineer actively chooses to do harm. We've also got the Justice Gang. Guy Gardner, this movie's Green Lantern, is kind of similar to Superman in that his powers come from outer space, and he doesn't really seem to do a lot of introspection, but whereas Superman is driven by a desire to do good, Green Lantern is just driven by his desires, and rather than using an oath or a vow to take responsibility for his power, Green Lantern uses his vows as an excuse to avoid responsibility. Mr. Terrific, like Superman, has access to futuristic technology, but he uses it to put nanomachines into people's blood without their knowledge or consent. He's also a lot more aloof than Superman is. Terrific cuts off a conversation with Lois by telling her he's not into people's emotions, he's willing to kill if it's the most efficient solution to a problem, and he gets frustrated when he's dealing with people who aren't as smart as he is. He seems to genuinely want to help people as a superhero, but he believes that because he's the smartest person in the room, he knows what's best for everyone else in it. If Green Lantern is the impulsive id of the Justice Gang and Mr. Terrific is the cold, calculating ego, then Hawkgirl is the superego and is the most concerned with how she's perceived. She wants to be taken seriously as a superhero, kicking back against the goofy Justice Gang name, and she specifically kills the president of Baravia after he calls her weak and delicate. And while Superman does let internet trolls get under his skin, he doesn't let it dictate his behavior, and even his reaction to the revelation about his Kryptonian parents has nothing to do with how he's perceived by the public at large, and is instead about how he thinks about himself. The Justice Gang also has a fourth member added late to the team, Metamorpho. Introduced as a captive of Lex Luthor, Rex Mason does what he does in order to save his son, in the same way that Superman turns himself over in order to try and save Krypto. But what sets them apart is that Rex is driven by fear and allows himself to be manipulated into hurting Superman in order to protect his son. What turns him around is watching Lex kill Malik. He realizes the extent of Luthor's evil and decides to help Superman, trusting that he can get to his son before Luthor's henchmen can hurt him. Alone, none of these characters can measure up to Superman. They're either too selfish, too distant, too self-conscious, or too afraid, but together they can. The boy praying for Superman to save him in Jaranpur doesn't get exactly what he wanted, but inspired by Superman's example, the Justice Gang working together is able to fill his place. And I think that's ultimately the lesson of the movie, that each of us knows intrinsically what good is, and even if there are things preventing us individually from living up to Superman's example, when we work together, that's when it becomes as easy for us as it is for him. None of us can save every dog or squirrel that needs help, but each of us maybe can save one. Everyone can do a little bit of good, and those little bits of good add up. This movie is a movie about Superman. It de-emphasizes Clark Kent and Kal-El because this time around, who he is under the cape doesn't really matter as much as what he represents as an ideal. This time around, Superman doesn't just have one or two secret identities. He has 8 billion.